So, welcome back to another episode of Nature Chat. I know we've been doing these sort of sporadically, but this is the show after the show where some of the people who are playing Nature Check stick around and talk about things. So today it's me, Cheryl, and also Peter, and one of our guest players from the first From the Annals of History game, Eric.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, Eric.
Good to be here. All right, so to recap what happened in the From the Annals of History episode, so the player characters were a bunch of people on a Tenebrian naval vessel that was coming back from some Tenebrian military endeavors on another continent, and the ship was, prior to the start of the game, or the curtain rising, the ship was caught in a terrible storm at sea and sort of separated from the rest of the fleet, and so when action started, the characters were having to figure out how to repair the ship and navigate it home, and then they realized that they might be running short on supplies because they were having trouble navigating home, and decided that they might want to make a pit stop at Arda to forage for some stuff when, oh no, a giant megalodon shark attacked them. And they were trying to fight the shark, and the shark was eating their boat and ate one of their sailors.
We were throwing sand at the shark, and
basically.
It was mildly irritated.
Basically. But then a bigger shark came along and saved them by attacking the first shark. It was really serendipitous. So they have now limped their way into the river mouth at the southeastern tip of Arda, which should sound familiar to everyone because that's a landmark in the main campaign.
What?
Whoa!
Yeah. So next time we need some filler content that isn't the main storyline, we will pick up with hopefully these same characters and another From the Annals of History story, and we'll see what happens to them now that they're at the mouth of this river on Arda.
Wait, hopefully these same characters. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, like if one of you wasn't able to play for some reason.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Next
If one of
time.
you has already been discovered as a mummy in the main campaign, or something. Giant shark.
I was undead the whole
Oh,
time.
no.
And I'm the only one who can turn undead.
Oh no!
Oh no!
Poor Blondie.
How does this work?
Oh.
I turned myself.
So I know, Peter, you were stressing out a lot during that game because there were a lot of rough rolls. But yeah, how did
So many bad rolls.
How did you guys feel about playing that module, because it was very different than what we normally do?
It was a great module. Yeah, it was like we just couldn't roll at all. Like hands down, out of all the D&D campaigns I've ever played, that session had the worst rolls. It was, yeah. I mean, not even that many critical failures, just a lot of sad rolls.
Mm-hmm.
Just a lot of not good.
Well, and then Joe rolled 2 natural 20s, but they were on reflex saves to not fall over. It wasn't like they were on attacks. Yeah.
That's one of my players was in the chat, and he got to witness these dice that I use at that table continue to roll poorly every time. But they have a joke that it sucks to have these metal dice when I'm one of the players or one of the characters. When I'm DM, it's great though. They love that. They love it when I'm DM and they use these dice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, having your DM roll bad is very satisfying.
They love that. They love it so much.
That's why I have literally I think 10 d20s back here, because I chronically roll poorly on non-digital dice. Actually, so I was a player on a different game that was live streamed on Twitch for a few months, and there was actually one session where one of the other players was so tired of me saying that I was an unlucky roller that he was asking for all 4 of the players to record the raw dice roll before we said our results kind of thing, and he did some stats on it and proved that yes, indeed, I do roll below average. So I have a lot of d20s because I sort of switch between them when I'm a DM, because otherwise nothing would ever happen.
See, I don't know if you can really statistically prove that, though.
I've definitely thought there are so many good rolls on the D&D podcasts that have been going for years, your Critical Roles, your Adventure Zones. It'd be so great if somebody would go through and like actually compile like all their different roles, and it's like,
Critical
oh
Role does
man,
that.
it's like, oh, Percy always rolls,
Oh my
so
God.
good, like
was
is
that-
is that
It was the specific
statistically
die,
unlikely?
though. It was the golden snitch
Yeah.
because like Taliesin used the golden snitch die while he was playing Percy, and he rolled 20s all the time. And then he gave it to Matt for the new campaign, and now Matt rolls 20s on it. So I think that die is just not weighted correctly.
Either there's a website and a group that's called Crit Roll Stats that does stats on all of the rolls from Critical Role.
Yep.
Oh my God.
And I think some of the sponsorships from the first season at least were like, here's how many 20s were rolled, here's how many ones were rolled, here's the first 20 that was rolled, and stuff like that. So there are some stats nerds out there who are doing that.
That's I love that. I love that there's somebody out there that does that.
I love that there's somebody who has not enough things to do.
Yeah. And it's also just like, hey, this would be a easy code to write. I could do this.
I could do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how you felt about the rolls. How did you feel about the shark?
That wasn't a shark. That was a monster.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I was gonna ask Eric about this. Like, so do you have a lot of experience with being attacked by megalodons? Is this a thing that happens in your everyday life?
One time, but I don't really want to talk about it. So.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
It's bringing up some memories. I'm gonna have to roll a will save to make it through the rest of the. No, I don't. I've briefly run, and I am running my own D&D session right now, but I haven't done a lot of
megalodons
creatures who are the enemies in my sessions. They're mostly there's an element where I just like having somebody where it's just like, this guy's objectively bad, and you should kill them.
Yeah.
And I'm running into issues because I like to have morally gray enemies in my session. And I'm running into a problem where, like, somebody who I'm bringing in to try to be helpful, for example, all my my PCs are going to be like, no, fuck you, get out of here. I don't trust you.
Your backstory is too complex.
And I'm like, no, what have I done? I do have a couple of things like the boulette is actually one thing that I have planned. Nice. Coming up, if my characters are watching this.
Can you tell our listeners what a boulette is?
I can try to remember. I think the boulette is like a giant. It's like a burrowing quadruped beast that eats large creatures.
It's like if a rhinoceros and a land shark had a very unhappy baby.
Yeah.
So it's got tremor sense, which is fun because it like burrows under the ground, but tremor sense means that it can like feel things vibrating the ground, so it can like sense you walking and just like pop up out from under you and eat you. And they're heavily armored and they're very tough.
Yeah. But that's the thing is that these are all creatures, and like creatures don't have an alignment.
They do in 3.5.
In 3.5, I think they're neutral in 3.5, right?
It really depends on the creature. Some of them are lawful or chaotic evil. Some of them are neutral. Some of them are good.
I guess
my cat is definitely chaotic evil. I'm saying.
But then there's like Malpasses and stuff like that. But yeah, I haven't done a lot of water-based adventures in my stuff. My friend who's running the other campaign, we're doing a pirate adventure, so there's a lot more water-based stuff there. But we haven't gotten too far.
That tracks. Yeah, pirates and water. I mean, in my limited experience with pirates,
there could be land pirates though.
They could be. So Eric, is it safe to say that you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons?
I am a little familiar with Dungeons and Dragons. So I'm more familiar with 5th edition. I will put that out there now. I started playing about maybe 2 years ago with my current group, and I was interested in DMing, and I really love world building because it's a really fascinating way to. It's a little bit like a PhD. In a kind of strange way. So let me give you an example. In the world that my friend and I built, I had a thought that there's only a finite number of elf souls that exist in this world. So there's only 10,000 of them or something like that, right?
Okay.
And so we took that idea and then we just followed it to the most extreme area that we could. We just kept following this thread of logic, and we said, all right, if there's only a finite number of elf souls, what happens if you have a half elf? Does it take up half an elf soul? Does it take a human soul? What we ended up deciding on is that a half elf still consumes a full elf soul. All right, what does that mean? That means that the only way for a half elf to be born with an elf soul is if there's an elf soul already present. There has to be a soul available for that new child to be born.
Okay.
And if there's elven blood in human bloodlines, humans breed more rapidly than elves. So even if there is a very thin amount of elven blood in humans, humans breed so rapidly that over time, more half-elves are going to be born than full-blooded elves. What does that mean?
Yeah.
That means that all the elven kingdoms are now running out of souls to repopulate their own kingdoms. All right, what does that mean? That means that now there's a faction of elves who go out and kidnap and human traffic half-elves or half-elf traffic half-elves to kill them and steal their souls and make full elf, and just you just follow a single thread as far as you can go, and that's the element of world building that I love. And you have to sometimes do research and you have to see what did people do in this time or how did these things work, and it's a really interesting anachronistic experience.
I like that you did that in I guess one direction is how I'm going to say it, because you were like, oh, well, so what if we set this condition, what would the effects of that condition be? For the Arda campaign, I did it in the opposite direction, because I want this to be the effect, right? That there's this continent that you guys need to explore because nobody's explored it yet, right?
Yeah.
And
now,
so then I had to trace it back and figure out what the conditions were.
Yeah, and I've probably done a little bit of both, but that's just one example of if I was a researcher moving forward, that's kind of the way it works out. But I did actually I got 3.5 edition back in high school, my senior year of high school. I had a friend who invited me over and we played one game and I thought it was interesting. And I was like, yeah, I wanna do that. So I think my brother got me a kit for my birthday or something like that. But then one of the things about D&D is you need to find a group who has the same idea of what they want out of a game that you do. And the problem that I ran into when I was 18 years old as a DM is that me and my friends had different ideas of what we wanted to get out of a session, and also I was not a great DM, so I would get frustrated when people were not doing the thing that I wanted to. Part of that was also my fault because I allowed my friends to be centaurs and half dragons and flying things and all sorts of stuff. And I had a friend I was trying to be like, all right, you're trying to explore the dungeon. And she's like, no, I fly around and I dust all the corners of the room because it's dusty. And I was like, no, I want to have a hardcore D&D campaign. And so there's just there was a mix there.
Everybody's first time DMing is really rough.
It was it happened that one time and then it never happened again. But I held on to the books.
I feel like most of us have probably... when we were angsty teens, we wrote angsty teen poetry or angsty teen fiction, right? And the first time...
Never.
Yeah.
No, I would never do that
ever.
and put it in my friend's purse so that she would read it later.
Mm-hmm, and if you were foolish enough to share it with someone else, right? It's really, it hurts a lot because you hand someone your baby and they read it and they rip it apart and you're like, oh, but I wrote that and I care about it, right? But when you're a DM, it's so much worse because you're like, here, I wrote this thing, and then your players are like, but I want to enlarge the guy who fell in the water so that the shark can't bite him, and you're like, what? I never thought of that. What are you doing?
Yeah.
And you have to scramble. So I made the same mistake as a first time DM where I was oh goodness. I was
Sorry.
trying to like hardcore like force my players to do what
Yeah.
I thought, so that it would fit my narrative, and it's like no. So now I've sort of taken it to the other extreme, and I like to build very sandboxy things, which is a lot of hard work. But it's more fun in the long run because it means everybody is constantly on their toes, including you.
Although there's also there's some give and take with all of that. The session I'm running right now, this like my players are exploring this island. It's very sandboxy, but one of the pieces of like I reach out to my players a lot, and I ask them like, what do you like, what do you not like, and I will help like tailor this experience for you because we're all players. Like the DM is another player, they just have different tools. So I have certain things that I want to do, but I also want to make sure my players have the experience that they want to get. And a piece of feedback I got is like the game that we're running right now, I love the amount of freedom I have, but it's so sandboxy that we can't figure out what we're supposed to do.
When there's no direction. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like, moving forward, I'm going to have a little bit more like direct, I'm not going to be like, this is the one thing you need to do, but I might be like, here's 3 quest lines you could follow.
Yeah, adventure hooks, right?
Yeah.
I like that you said that the DM is a player too, just with different tools. Peter, if you remember, like the session that we did all together, like to set up our characters for the Artie campaign before we actually went live, and I told you guys, I said D&D is a story that you tell with your friends, right? So like we don't get to be the angsty teen author sitting alone in your room with a notebook, right? Like we have to all make the story together, which means that I sort of give up control and give up that like, oh, I'm hurt if you don't do it exactly the way I want. I'm excited because you've contributed something. So
D&D is a fantastic yes and experience. If you've ever done improv,
yeah.
So like one of the things that even I've done a little bit of DMing, so I'm more experienced in it now, but I still have a tendency when my players, like if they have a backstory element or something like that and they want to say, here's the thing that I said, my gut instinct is to be like, no, that doesn't fit into my world. But I have to like tune that out and like take a step back and be like, okay, here's something I didn't know about my world. What can I do with that? And then try and turn it into a yes and say like, okay, here's the thing that exists. I think actually it would work really well this way, and then we collaborate. Like each of my players' characters is a collaboration between themselves and me, and I've helped them.
Absolutely.
They come up with an idea, and then I say, that sounds really cool. How does this sound on top of it? Like, here's this element of the world that I've built, or something like that. And then together we go back and forth, and we build a character together that fits in with everything that's there, and ultimately is more exciting to the players.
Absolutely. A great example of that in the Arctic campaign. Lucanus is the one who shaped the fate of the elves, right? The fact that elves are almost extinct on this planet was because of things that he and I developed together. That Joe and I developed together. He was
Peter doesn't know about this at all.
No.
Yeah.
The fact that elves are almost entirely extinct is something that like he developed, or like half the people in New Seychester are people that Nancy had ideas for and was like, so I'm friends with this person and I have this relationship with this person, and I was like, great, yeah, let's do it, because it means that I don't have to do as much world building if you're like telling me what the people are.
And that's what I love about world building, is that it's so cooperative and collaborative. And like religion is one of those things that always is fantastic. I have a player in my campaign who is a cleric, and so I said, okay, let's take this opportunity to like flesh out what this means. And he had an idea for a church, and I said, that sounds really cool. What if this one church and everything that you had here was part of a larger organization of everything else? And together as a cabal, your goal was to do this, to prevent planar influences into the prime material plane or something like that. And like every time we've gone back and forth, he said like, yes, that sounds awesome. Like that's really, and he's really excited about it. It's kind of the same thing that I did with Radiant Marcus Brown. Here in this campaign is, I mean, you gave me a character who was a cleric of Paylor. But you didn't have an established narrative of who Paylor is. You had some ideas of here's what the nation is like. And so what I tried to do was I because at least the deities that you have are based off of Greyhawk.
Yeah.
They're based off of just the traditional 3.5 edition.
Mm-hmm.
I read into that. I pulled a whole bunch of notes of like, what do people normally do? What are the things that people normally say? What are the things that they'll, I have a list of like other saints, like other big clerics. And one of the guys who was there, I didn't get a chance to talk about it on the session, but there's a cleric named Saint Yalnir the Gentle, who is a half-orc. That means something in your world. Where if the Tenebrians see the orcs as like savages or something like that, the fact that there's a half-orc who is elevated up in Pelor's eyes means that even the uncivilized savages of these other nations can find redemption inside of Pelor's church, and that has a very specific meaning inside of the world. So I tried to build a lot of that into what you already had and then build on top of it.
Yeah. And it's even interesting to think about, like, oh, you've got that list of characters, but like, you could take Yalnir the Gentle, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you could take him as that sort of story, but another way to take it, which maybe the Tenebrian royal house would see this, that like you would be very like apologist about it, where you like find some sort of way of twisting the story to make it sound like really exceptional in some other way, because maybe the half-orc thing doesn't fit with the narrative very well. And so it's interesting to think about, like, how do you contribute to the story, because of course I'm not going to come up with 6 versions of every religion in the world on the off chance that we encounter them in the game. Like, no. We just sort of come up with them as we get to them.
And that was one of the things that we talked about, because Tenebria is based on like colonial England, which had the Church of England there. One of the things I had chatted with you about is, I said, like, you gave me these points in swim or in climb or something like that, but I'm wearing armor, so I'm going to sink anyway. And can I take these points and move them somewhere else? And you're like, yeah, that's fine. And I was originally thinking maybe I'll put them into a language and I'll learn Celestial, for example. And then I thought about, like, what is the real-world analog of what you're doing? And it said, all right, it's the Church of England. The Church of England rejected Latin as the language of the church, and they instated English. So if there's a schism in the Church of Pelor, sort of mirroring the same thing, it wouldn't make sense for me as a Tenebrian cleric of Pelor to have learned Celestial, which I see as, like, the Latin of this world. So I was like, I could have done that, but it makes more sense from a like world building perspective to have said that we've rejected this language that's hard to learn, and like only highly educated people can learn it, and instead they've built a church on Common or Tenebrian, which is also like another thing that I do in my campaign. I don't have a common language. I have human.
Okay.
I have the human language, and then like a secondary common language is actually the Gnomish language. So depending on what continent you're on, one of those 2 languages will be the common language, but there's no, like, I don't know, it's another one of those like almost Tolkien kind of things that like carries over, or like the standard fantasy of like human is the default, human is the most important race or ancestry or whatever term you want to use for that. And I was like,
no, I think default is good. I think because it parallels well with like in a lot of our literature or culture, like whiteness being the default, right, and everybody else being like, oh, well, they're like this but slightly different, in this particular way. And so I think, in a lot of fantasy, you see that as humans are the standard, and then like say like Star Trek, you're like, oh, the Klingons are like humans, but they're more angry, the Ferengi are like humans, but they're greedier, it's like, you just have this kind of like core.
Human is the pin, which I mean, it makes sense because we are humans when we're doing that, but there's things that you can introduce in a world that suggest that human is not necessarily the default.
But it takes work, right? I think as a DM, like creating a world like that, like it's, and I think we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but like, that it's very easy to fall into the kind of fantasy trope of like medieval Europe, and so like spreading out and exploring, trying to create or adapt cultural elements from real life into a campaign and world build that way. It can be there are a lot of challenges and pitfalls in there.
Well, and that's
so. I wanted to ask, so to go back to kind of what you were talking about earlier about, like how, like, it's so cool, like your example of like, if we take this axiom of like, oh, there are so many elf souls, like I love that idea of kind of saying, if this, then what happens? And I think, that's something that I think a lot of scientists will kind of relate to, like, oh, like in all these fantasy worlds, there's so many things like this where it's like, if you drill down into it, it's like, there aren't enough farmers in this world to support the standing army that they're claiming that they have, or there's no way that the local herbivory population can support the amount of caloric intake that a dragon is gonna need. There are all these things that you kind of drill down into that. Do you find that I don't know who you play with. Are the people you play with other scientists? Do they, like, when they're collaboratively world building with you, do they play along with that game? Like, is that the kind of thing that they're into?
Some things, yes. So one of my players is in 5th edition. There is a what is it? She's a gunslinger, which comes from Critical Role, but it's a fighter backdrop. All the people that I play with are. Let's see, 3 of them are biomedical engineers, and then one of them is a graphic artist who's married to one of the other engineers. So a lot of nerds in lots of different ways. Peter, what would you ask?
Do people like playing a science-heavy, concept-heavy game with you?
So my gunslinger character, she's very engineering focused. And so she wanted to do a character where she designs and builds and creates new things that are not in the game. Mm-hmm. And so I've been working with her on coming up with a crafting system to work for that. So one of the things that she wanted to do was, for example, for her rifle, she wanted to have like a little scope light on the end. That creates a light. She's a human, so she doesn't have dark vision, and she's not a caster, so she doesn't have a way to do that. And so she said, "What would it take for me to create like a little thing that just has a light, like a light cantrip on the end of it?" Mm-hmm. And I thought about it for a little bit, and I said, "Okay, like creating the actual housing is going to be really easy. You can just do that with scrap metal. The harder part is going to be getting a permanent light cantrip onto something." And so it'll take a little bit of time for you to build the thing, but you will have to talk to somebody like the wizard in the party, conveniently enough. Mm-hmm. Talk to him. You will have to do some research, like X number of hours of research or X number of successful checks of research on how to do a permanent light cantrip. You'll have to spend some money to do it. You'll have to find out, what's going to end up happening is something like, all right, you need, like, the material components to cast the light cantrip are either glowing mushroom, glowing fungus, or firefly thoraxes. So you're going to need, like, a bucket of firefly butts to be able to create a permanent version of this. Mm-hmm. And you need something to affix that on, and that'll probably be a pearl of a certain size because a pearl has a specific magical blah, blah, blah.
A bucket of firefly butts.
Yeah. So, just coming up with something like that of like, and that's one of the things I really like about 5th edition in particular is that because the rule set is very simple, it's really easy for me to come up with stuff that is outside of my expectations. Mm-hmm. So, like Cheryl, you were talking about like you weren't expecting me to use enlarged person on somebody in the water.
Great, yeah.
Which is great. I love doing stuff that's a little bit outside of the expectation like that, but it's a little bit easier to balance some of that stuff or make a ruling about how something will work when there are fewer rules in place. And so the simplicity with which 5th edition has done that, I really appreciate for that purpose. Yeah. But I also understand that there are people who prefer Pathfinder or 3.5 who like a little bit more rigor in the rules that are there, so it's less of the DM just coming up with something random on the spot, and more of a calculated strategic.
Yeah, it's not about rigor as in like, oh, you're not allowed to be creative, but like I said, I constantly use the word realistic in quotes, but I feel like just
Yeah.
having advantage or disadvantage, like it makes it really easy for you to just like very quickly make decisions, whereas like as a 3-5 DM, I have to like know the rules really well so that I remember all of the numbers in my
Do I
head,
give
right?
this
But
person a +1 or a +2
exactly,
or a +5?
but I think that
And
that you know it makes more sense to me
yeah,
because a lot of things in life are more nuanced than that, right? Like advantage or disadvantage winds up being like setting up this black and white dichotomy, whereas like having +2 or -3 or whatever allows for a little more like wiggle room
yeah,
and yeah, also having those rules means that DMs are allowed to make arbitrary decisions. That's part of telling the story, but I try not to make arbitrary decisions because I don't want
yeah.
things to feel unfair.
Yep.
Because again, we're working together on this story. It's not my story for you to play through. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
one of the reasons I tend to like those rules, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this again going back to something you said earlier, but you were talking about like when you were first starting out being a DM, and you everybody's crappy when they're DMing for the first time. But I think so much of that is like finding the group that fits with whatever play style you're playing, right?
Yeah.
Because there are some groups where I have played like some of the absolute best D&D sessions ever. It was like there was no combat and we were like haggling with a merchant or like doing something really stupid. It's like we wanted to, convince some NPC to do this. And then there are other games where it's like they're very combat focused, and and a lot of that is the party, what they want to do, and the DM, and like I think all of those are good and valid play styles, and so much of that is finding like the people that work for you, and obviously there's a lot of gray area of like this group that is traditionally like a very rule following group. Maybe you have a session where you're all just like cutting loose and you do something goofy, and I think so much of it is kind of lucking into good personalities that get along and mesh well and can really carry something cool and new and different forward. But that's something I love about the game is that there is that kind of the whole spectrum of gray area.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. And so you've got your DMs, you've got your party. You've got your editions or your Pathfinder, your game that you're actually playing. All of those factors, play into, what's going to just make the best play session. And you never know. It's too many factors to really
it's
pick
chemistry.
the best one. You just got to kind of throw it at the wall and see what sticks. And
roll a
sometimes
d20 and see how your group is.
Exactly.
I really love the point you made about group dynamic, though. I'm sort of fascinated by group dynamics because I've been a team building facilitator and stuff like that before. So yeah, like how different groups of people work together is really fascinating to me. And I guess that was one of those things about Nature Check where it was like, oh well, we just sort of put together some people who responded to Joe's tweet, and I was like, how is this gonna work? And then it worked out really well. And then tonight was the first time that we had guest players, and I was like, well, I like Eric and Emily, like they're friends with me, and I know that they're nerds and they like D&D, but like, are they actually going to jive with like Joe and
No,
Peter? Like, how is
I
this
think
gonna...
Eric sucks a lot. I don't like him at all.
I also think that Eric sucks a lot. So we have a lot fuck that guy.
But it's a real concern, especially because our goal is to have a lot of guest players on Nature Check, right? It's always like, okay, well, this person can be really cool individually or in certain groups, but like, how are we all gonna work together? And that's like, it's scary and exciting.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that I did before I started running my session was I sent out a poll to my players, and I asked them a whole bunch of questions. I asked them things like, do you want high fantasy or dark fantasy? Do you want like gritty realism or do you want like hand wavy stuff? Do you want magic to be ubiquitous or super rare? Are you looking for strategic combat or just hack and slash? So I asked all of my players like all of these different things, and the feedback that I got from it gave me a really good indicator of like, what is someone looking for out of the game? And it's also, I mean, also that is not going to be constant. Like if I finish this campaign and we do another campaign later, they might give me totally different, like they might have gotten their fill of hack and slash and now they want something more strategic, or they might have might be tired of the low magic fantasy that I've run, and they want to do something more like Eberron where magic is everywhere. And it's given me an idea, and obviously like I'm not able to touch on everything that everybody wanted, but one of the most important pieces of feedback that I got was I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept of lines and veils. So lines and veils is the word coming to mind is like security, but that's not the right word. It's like Cheryl, help me out. What's the word I'm looking for?
A concept, a framework, a.
Let me just explain it, and then maybe you'll be able to come up with it.
What we should do is we just pause, and then we'll just edit in the word that you meant to say later, right?
All right. So editing, Cheryl. I'm gonna move my mouth. It's a type of thing.
But for the record, we don't edit shit in, so you just put something in that.
Okay.
But it was really adorable. If you try.
Okay, it's not like I couldn't, but I'm not going to because it was funny.
It was good.
All right. So lines and veils. A line is something where in session somebody might be uncomfortable and they would just prefer to. Let me back up. A veil is where somebody might be uncomfortable and they're not uncomfortable with the topic being in the game, but they don't want to dwell on it. So it's okay for a common example of this is torture in D&D. So somebody might not want to do a play-by-play of a torture scene. They might be okay with it being in the game, but they would prefer you to just kind of draw a veil over it and then move on.
It's like the fade to black cutscene in
exactly.
like a romance novel that isn't super torrid, or like a movie that is trying not to be rated R. Yeah.
Sure, the pan to fireplace.
Whereas a line is something where under no circumstances is somebody interested in having this concept in the game. So, for example, a really common one is like sexual assault. Like there are people who are not interested at all in dealing anything with that topic, and that is totally understandable. And what I wanted to do was to ask my players, like, what are the lines that you have? What do you absolutely not want at all in the game? And then what are the veils that you have? What are the concepts that are okay, but you just don't want to deal with them? You don't want to do a play-by-play for whatever. And it gave me a really good. It's a really good safety mechanism to figure out beforehand what are the things that we should watch out for. And there's a lot of these safety mechanisms. Some other examples for D&D that I've seen are there's one called the X card, which is you have a card with an X on it just on the table, and if somebody's uncomfortable with whatever's going on, they tap the card, the DM knows, and then they just wrap it up and move on. Nobody talks about it. The flip side of that is that there's another concept called it's just the O card, like a circle, and if somebody is like really into like whatever's going on, even if it's kind of difficult, they might tap the O card and say like, this is tough, but like I'm good.
Yeah, sometimes the best storytelling happens when we're challenging ourselves.
Yeah.
I know we had this conversation both with the colonialism discussion in our first Nature Check episode, and then in the sex work conversation during our second Nature Chat. This idea that, well, like, the wonderful and terrible thing about D&D is that, like, you can really incorporate almost anything. And so, yes, this game can be a way for us to explore a lot of real-world issues, but, like, yeah, how we do that is really important. Not just that we're like, oh, we're going to talk about this thing, but, like, the how, the method is what really becomes very important.
And I feel like this kind of brings up what we had talked about a little bit before jumping on the show here of the rule that I have in my game for like for incorporating elements from another culture, for example. The rule I have at my table is that if you want to sort of appropriate something from another culture, like a what's the word I'm looking for? Like a marginalized culture. So, for example, something like a Native American headdress or something like that. because it's a fantasy game, like it's understandable that people will want to incorporate some of these elements because they like the idea behind them or something like that. The rule that I have at my table is it is acceptable for you to use those for your character, but you have to do the research and fully understand what it is that you are incorporating, and then whatever importance it has in the real world, you need to have some similar importance for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's and I leave that up to my players of like, do you feel that you have a good enough understanding of what that means? So if we're talking about LGBT issues or characters or trans characters or something like that, that is not something that for me I feel like I would have enough understanding to be able to implement respectively.
Mm-hmm.
So and maybe that's another issue that they're just not represented at all. But I don't know how to incorporate that in a way that is fully truthful and respectful of all of the issues that someone would go through. And then we talked about that before. The totally opposite side of that is that I build I build a world entirely around things that I know and that I'm comfortable with, which is a very, very small subset of the amount of things that are out there. And then whatever I've built has just ended up being homogenous anyway. So there are these two very different extremes to world building in general, and really the only way to get around that is to learn and to read and to listen as much as you can.
Yeah. It's an enormous philosophical discussion that I don't think anybody has a right answer to, but I guess the way I come at D&D, because I've said this before, I was a huge theater nerd when I was younger, right? And I was definitely typecast to be a certain kind of character for a lot of my high school theater career, where the character was very much like me, right? And then my senior year, I was cast to be this character which is entirely unlike myself, and I spent the entire semester trying to figure out how to play her, because I was just like, this is not, I don't have anything in common with her. And it was a lot of thinking, and I didn't do hard research because she was still like me. It was just her personality was entirely separate from mine. But yeah, it was a lot of like soul searching and a real amazing exercise in empathy. And so I sort of think about D&D the same way, right? Like, we have the opportunity, whether or not you choose to do it is up to you, but like, you have the opportunity to play someone who is entirely separate from you, or to experience things that you have not experienced in your own life. And I like the idea of incorporating so much research, like Eric said, because you can't just be like, oh, well, we're going to talk about this now. I don't know anything about it, but I'm going to like pretend, because that only leads to disaster. But I do think that it's important to use this vehicle to talk about issues and amplify voices and things like that. I think Deb Morrison did an excellent job of talking about power and using power responsibly. So she was the keynote speaker at ComSciCon Chicago recently that we were both at. And she talked about scientists and science communicators using their power to amplify the voices of other people, and also to speak for organisms that don't have voices of their own. And that really touched me. And that's something that I'd already been trying to do with this game and with my other science communication projects, but like, it was very impactful, and I'm thinking about that more as we go forward in this campaign. Like, how do we use our power and our privilege and our position to amplify those stories in a respectful way?
That's hard. I mean, like, all of us are cis white people, it's hard. I think it's almost impossible for us to emulate or kind of pretend to speak for anybody else, but anything that we can do to amplify somebody else's voice, is I mean,
And that, I think that's the real point, right? You just said
yeah,
you can't pretend to speak for anyone else, and
yeah,
that was Deb's point, which
Yeah.
was
yeah,
incredibly strong. She said other people have their own voices. You don't ever
hmm,
need to speak for other
yeah,
people. We need to speak for
right,
I am the Lorax, I speak for the trees, right? We need to speak
right,
for other organisms that don't have their own voices, but all other people do have their own voices. It's
right,
just about helping
Yeah.
them be
right.
louder. Yeah.
But as DMs, you are called upon to speak for many other people. So so that is something that you have to come across, right? As like you do have to speak for people, and if you want to bring people, NPCs, but still, people, personalities and characters and cultures and things like that into your campaign, you are going to have to step into that role of
Well,
speaking for other
Yeah.
people.
that's as simple as every time I play a character who's male, though, right? Like,
Hmm.
I can drop my voice and make different facial expressions, but like I don't know what it's like to be a dude.
Well,
And being a dude is not a homogenous experience, just like being a woman is not a homogenous experience. So like, yeah, no, every character I run in a D&D campaign, unless it was literally a character named Cheryl who looked and acted and felt about things exactly the way I do,
yeah.
is going to be, it's going to be someone else. And that's, it's the fun and the scary challenge.
But
Hmm.
one of the interesting things, the question that I asked Deb during this keynote that I want to bring up here is the idea of intersectionality, which is
Hmm.
so for example, Cheryl, you're just talking about like, yeah, I don't know what it's like to be a dude, but you have an idea of what it's like to be white. So there's an element of being white that if you were to play as a white man, there's an element that transfers and there's an element that doesn't. But that doesn't like playing as a white man and playing as a black man, for example, those are going to be like two very different things. And so I I follow a lot of activists of various types on Twitter, which is it's one of the best things that I found about Twitter is just the amount of different voices that I can expose myself to and fill my timeline with. And because I happen to work in the medical field, so I find a lot of I find I am more geared towards disability activism than I think a lot of other people are. I feel like disability is one of those things that tends to not be considered. A lot of people consider gender and they consider sexual orientation and race, but then ableism is not one of those things there. But
Hmm.
um, I don't know if either of you two watch Queer Eye.
Oh
Okay,
yeah, yeah.
I don't, but I saw Twitter explode about one particular episode, and it was an episode about a black man who he runs a nonprofit called Disabled but Not Really.
Hmm.
So if I remember correctly, I believe this individual uses a wheelchair, and he runs a nonprofit called Disabled but Not Really, which provides sort of disability services or fitness services for people in the black community who are also disabled. When this episode came out, disability Twitter was not happy with
Hmm.
this episode because the idea of disabled but not really to them is hiding the fact that disability is a thing and downplaying the importance of disability.
Hmm.
And so for several, maybe 1 or 2 weeks, there was a lot of complaints about this episode and the way that things were framed and the way that um, it seemed like the episode was trying to downplay uh, the importance of identifying as a disabled person.
Hmm.
Um, but there was um, a black disabled woman, Imani. I don't remember her last name. I can look it up and give it to you. But she wrote an article from her perspective as a black disabled woman of how the episode was actually really great because and it brought a lot of perspective of not only the disability community but the black disability community and bringing elements of for example it's more difficult in the black community to bring up a disability than it is in the white community. There's a privilege between those two. So what this gentleman in the episode was doing by creating this nonprofit, Disabled But Not Really, and focusing on black disabled people, was that he was focusing on a community that was underserved and trying to get them the help that they needed, regardless of what normal disability Twitter might have said about identifying as a disabled person or not. So it was a really interesting, and then after she wrote this article, that article spread, and like most of disability Twitter was like, I didn't realize that, thank you for bringing it up. So there's this intersectionality in this specific instance between someone who is disabled and someone who is black. Each person has their own individual experiences, but then somebody who is both black and disabled has experiences that is not necessarily, it's not just a sum of those two things, it is something completely different. And so it's really interesting to see that, and it's kind of it's opened my eyes to how important it is to have those different intersections visible and out there. So
no, that's an incredibly valuable point, and I feel like we get into such deep discussions in these games and in these chats, and of course, like we say, oh, none of us have the answers, and we're certainly not going to solve these problems in a 45-minute conversation. But I do really appreciate you guys talking about D&D and talking about sensitivity and talking about how we use this game to tell stories. Thank you so much, everyone out there watching or listening to us. Don't forget that we will be back on Saturday, September 14th with another regular Nature Check game. Do you guys have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I just looked up the person I was talking about. Her name is Imani Barbarin. She goes by Crutches and Spice on Twitter.
Nice.
And her website, so definitely look her up. She's writing a lot of really incredible stuff, and she also has a Patreon if you want to consider supporting the work that she does as well.
Very cool.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Eric. I just wanted to say that was fabulous. You've been great tonight, and I look forward to the next time you're on, because I really want to hear more about your research, and I'm very excited to hear all the cool details about that. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, everybody listening should tune back in next time.
Yeah.
I'm excited about it. I hope they are too.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, thank you both. Thank you so much, Eric, for being a guest player and coming on Nature Chat with us.
Of course.
We will see everybody next time. Bye.
All right.